Hello, everyone, and welcome to Experiment Q podcast, episode number 9 that we shoot in London with a very special guest today, Lucian from Minerva Schools. And I say special because the team behind this project took a lot of courage to take on the elite universities and to restructure, rethink them from the ground up, from the way they, recruit people, the way they put learning science at the center of the school, and the way they think about curriculum, to the way they help students enter in the labor market and lead new projects for the world, the well-being of the students, and so much more. So basically, the inspiration for this conversation today comes from two sources. First, we met because of your talk in Paris, at CRE Paris, where you introduced Minerva Schools to the local education community. And then you advised me to read the book, Building the Intentional University, and that you probably can see here. Otherwise, I'll put the link to the Amazon and other options where you can buy the book. And it's been an amazing reading ride. I made highlights on every single page, things I need to check on the learning science, which I'm very focused on, and on the way you think about the brand, the outreach, and so much more. So before we go into Minerva Schools and the book, I would love for us to take a moment and to give a bit of the context about you and your story. So can you introduce the story of Lucian Cosinschi to the Experiment Q community? And you'll need a microphone for that.
All right, so thank you very much for this invitation.
Pleasure.
I wonder what I should say other than maybe that's something relevant to the education world in general. I grew up in Romania, and I was 9 when the revolution happened there.
Wow.
So I caught many waves of innovations in education in that system, transitioning from the communist to sort of capitalist, some type of capitalism system. And maybe every few years, there's a new minister for education. So I got a lot of that. And then I got the chance to go to universities that were just starting, several, on a couple of cases. And I think when I decided what I want to do with my life, I thought education is a place where I can contribute.
And why is that? Did you have a aha moment, like education, that's it?
Not really. It was more of a systematic decision-making process about, what can I do, what my skills are, what do I care about, and, looking out there in the world, what are the needs, kind of thing, where I can make some impact.
Yeah. And I was trying to, not trying to, I actually did my research of trying to find as much information on you as possible before the...
Yeah, you found things that I completely forgot about.
So there was like a very interesting series of YouTube videos of your research early on. But one thing that popped out was the way you describe yourself for years was kind of a designer of learning experiences. So that's what you did for a couple of projects. What does it mean? Like, how do you design a learning experience?
Well, I thought the main thing is that there is something special about learning compared to other, endeavors in some way. In that it's really not a product that you deliver to someone. So they need to do the learning, which is a bit tricky because, we have an educational system, the usual way to teach, I suppose, at many levels is lecturing. So, the professor is delivering the particular lecture and people listen, etc., etc. And that's the way we think learning works, or this is the way we apply it right now. And I always thought that that's not the right way, because many reasons. But one of the reasons is that I think what I was trying to do is design a situation where the student cannot do anything else but learn something. So that's a very different thing, because the learning still needs to come from the student.
Yeah.
No matter how how well prepared you might be, if you don't take that into account, I don't think the learning process will succeed. So I think this is why I was focusing on what are the elements that I could put around someone so that they get that spark. And ideally, they see it as their own insight, regardless of, the way I do it.
So going for your biography, what I found there was, one is the project Pomegranate, right? That I would love if you share what exactly did you do there. And then there is also the NYU Berlin. So what is the story after you left Romania and ventured in the world? What projects were in between, and in between, that moment in 90s and the work that you do today?
A lot of stuff. So maybe very importantly, I decided relatively early on that I don't want to have a career. In that, people were talking about, when I was in high school and then university and so on, that there are certain things that you need to do, certain, maybe years that you need to be in a job, certain path you need to take, etc., to build a career. And I made the decision that I'll find out what my career was looking back, rather than looking forward. So
that's interesting.
Well, I was sort of open to learn a lot of things. And when I left Romania, I went to this new university in Berlin at the time. Lots of things opened for me. But one of the things, I guess, that was more on an informal learning rather than the schools necessarily, was that I met a community of travelers. So I suddenly learned that it's possible to hitchhike around the world for little to no money. And that knowledge, in a sense, I felt the duty to travel because of that, because I think I wanted to travel for a long time, and I felt I don't have the the money to do it, basically. And then when I discovered that you can do this, and not only you can do it for free, but you get a very different type of interaction with people as you go do this, I felt it was my duty to do it. So at some point, I decided to go on like a year's trip around Europe. And I remember thinking, as I was packing my bags, whether I should take 30 euro with me or 10 euro with me.
Wow.
So yeah, that was an interesting, it was interesting to realize how far I came from, feeling limited by money and finances and so on and so forth. So I guess that was a big thing to start with. But then as like that trip was going on, I realized that what I care most about is like the learning. So this is stuff that I knew before, but then I realized that I would like to do that every day. If you can use the idea of like building something, I'd like to put a brick in that construction every day. So, and this is harder when you travel, and especially harder when you travel without money. And it's especially harder if you don't have one project, but you contribute to lots of things. So I thought, okay, I'd like to contribute to something in particular. And I was, lucky to meet the right people at the right time, basically, to build this experience.
Okay. So the experience is Pomegranate, or it's
I guess Chronologically would be NYU, Pomegranate, and Minerva.
Okay. So how, because the interview is mostly focused on Minerva and the book and your experience now, how did you discover the project? How did you become the regional manager for Europe and the director for student experience and partnerships?
So I guess it started from Pomegranate, because when I started Pomegranate, I decided to look around and see what interesting things happen in education. And I both traveled around for a few months around Europe, and I also, of course, researched the internet thoroughly. So on one of those searches, I found Minerva. I found actually Stephen Coslin, who's the founding dean at Minerva. He's a well-known specialist in the science of learning, and I found some of his books, and then I looked him up. And he was just moving from Harvard and Stanford to this new thing called Minerva. Yeah. And it sounded good, right? At that point, I had some ideas about what I think is worthy to do in education, and a certain idea of a path that I was willing to take, and this is why I was starting Pomegranate. But Minerva kept I kept Minerva in the back of my mind, and at some point, I was checking from time to time, like how the model develops, etc. And at some point, I saw they're planning to come to Berlin to have students in Berlin.
And what year was that?
It must have been 2014 something.
Yeah.
And I thought, I could help them with what I'm doing with Pomegranate, for example. So let's see. And before I sent that email, I was kind of working on this email for a while. And before I sent it, I met the person who was the managing director for Europe and the Middle East at the time. And I met them in person at one conference. And I was like, I'm sure you're not from this Minerva that I'm very excited about, right? And she's like, no, I'm exactly from that Minerva. So I was like, then I was planning to send you an email, so maybe we can talk about it. So we talked about it, and then I guess I started doing more and more things, thinking about ways to collaborate, until a point where they're like, well, don't you want to do this full time? So
that's interesting. So for people that are watching and listening to this, so first there was a value you provided to them, and then there was the official deal to work together, because so many, especially young people, expect stuff from employers or from other people before they show anything or any value. So I think that's an important lesson for everyone.
I can see where you're coming from. Yes. Well, I am passionate about education in general, right? So, and I think there's a lot one can do. And of course, when I find any initiative that sounds good, I'm very happy to support it in any way I can. So, and there were a few relatively clear things that I could do for Minerva. Some of them were not timed right. So, for example, Pomegranate, one of the things that Pomegranate was doing was like creating really mentored internships, like really high quality internships. And we talked about that, but Minerva was, a couple of years away from the students actually needing that, for example. And then, of course, there were the immediate things that I could help with in Berlin. So I was like, I'm very happy to have a look here and there and so on. So, I guess the way I'm thinking about it is if you have time, you should do whatever you find is valuable. So I am happy to jump in with anything. And I think that's valid through today. And it's also how Minerva thinks of things, in a sense. As we talked about it before, Minerva not only is a university and is an institute and a project, etc., but also wants to have an impact in the dialogue about education.
Yeah.
It's a big sort of ambition.
So right now, let's jump right into the dialogue and talk about the work that Minerva is doing and all the effort behind it.
All right.
Okay, so a quick introduction or overview of the Building the Intentional University, the book that
I'm very curious how this will be quick.
Yeah, I'll try. So to just give an overview, the team behind Minerva Schools published a book recently, so November 2017. And I had the opportunity to read it over the last 2 weeks. And it's basically a timeline of all the things that people behind Minerva did, or most of them, as a lot of details I'm sure cannot fit into the book. But basically, it's the story of how the school was created, from the inception moment to recruiting key people, to thinking about the learning of science, to thinking about the role of higher education in our society and the skills that the young people need for the future, and so much more. I cannot summarize everything in one book, but gives a good overview of the tremendous effort that people behind Minerva put into making this project a reality.
One thing that I would add to that is the book also illustrates how every department works at Minerva to a great extent. Yeah. And that's important because you can take it, criticize it, build on it, steal it, etc.
Yeah, so it's a timeline of facts, and it's also a description of how it functions, the recruitment of students, the curriculum, the well-being and the career development of students, and so much more. So for everyone listening and seeing this video, this is just an overview. We try to develop some of the key ideas from the book, but if you really want to see the work that is going into reinventing basically higher education, and not any form of higher education, but basically elite university, developing and facilitating the development of the leaders of tomorrow. I highly recommend this book. It was very insightful for me. As I said at the beginning, I made highlights on every single page, and I need to go back and check on a lot of resources. But now, from your point of view as an insider, and I know there's no short answer to this, but how do you define Minerva? What is Minerva?
Oh my God. Wow. Well, so I'm suddenly thinking about what is the definition. So if I remember correctly, there are a couple of types of definitions. So one type would be, contrasting with other similar things.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if that's a short definition. Minerva does very reasonable things. For example, builds upon the science of learning, what we know about how students learn, and takes that seriously and applies it in the system, in the academic system. So, there's a lot to say about that alone. And it has, while that sounds reasonable, it has an impact that would definitely make people, would surprise people, no doubt. So, for example, there are no lectures at Minerva, right? That is, some people think that's a radical difference. It's, as it comes out from the research on this, learning through lectures doesn't work very well. So
I think in the book it says it's a great way or efficient way to teach as to disseminate, and it's a horrible idea for learning.
Right. I mean, there are many studies around this, and this is something that's accepted everywhere. However, everybody else keeps doing it. So in a sense, there is this reasonable thing that Minerva actually does that is surprising.
Yeah.
That ends up being surprising. So that would be one aspect. Then there are just many other areas where the founders, as they started thinking about this, they went down to the basic principles. What is education for? What should it look like in the 21st century? If you start a great university focused on students in the 21st century, what should it look like? And the fact that we started from scratch is incredible, right? We get to ask the question like, where should students learn? Where, right? That is not a normal question. Any existing
so by default is
institution.
in the classroom.
You have You have in the classroom. You have we have this building here, so this is what we're going to use, and we have certain limitations about this, etc., etc. Right? You get to whereas Minerva gets to be like, I think for university students they need to experience the world, right? That is a big difference. But because we get to ask these basic questions. Also, we get to ask the question, for example, what should your classmates be like? Right? What is the group that you'd be thrilled to be in to learn? So we build this in the admission system. So there are all sorts of things like this that I'm not sure we can distill them to like one easy thing, but I think they definitely form the reason for what Minerva is built like.
I think to me, and you mentioned this, what Minerva is basically an effort to basically take apart higher education, elite higher education, and rethinking every single gear in the system,
right?
To basically put together something that is actual for this time and the challenges that we face today.
Right, today. And this is, I think this is, it's both a simple idea and it makes it relatively complicated because to understand Minerva, you need a bit more effort than you'd expect, right? You grow up hearing about how universities work in general. And Minerva, of course, fulfills a lot of the same things that other universities go for. But they are put in a different way. They work together differently. There are many differences that go beyond what a usual university would consider education. So there are many things like this that require quite a bit of time to understand.
So in one of the early talks of Ben Nelson, right, the CEO and the founder, he says that the most recent participant in the elite education and the higher education started 100+ years ago. And after this enormous gap, here is Minerva. Why now it's the right time? Why do we need Minerva now?
Wow. So, well, I think we needed Minerva a long time ago, basically. A university focused on learning seems like a reasonable idea, but it's not something that you often get. I think it works now for several reasons. Technology is one, for example. We have a lot of things that we do that we can implement this way because the technology is mature enough. That's important. Secondly, of course, there's more research. We have a century of research in psychology, sociology, learning sciences. You get to build upon that. And not only that, but you get to build a system that learns from every new discovery, in a sense. Right? Rather than being how it was when we started it in 1500s, you get to be like, oh, no. We know how science works, so we can build things that improve with the knowledge.
And I felt also through the book, and it's kind of evident also in the education community now that so technology enables the type of work that Minerva does, but also it challenges the status quo in that it used to be like a standard path. You go through university and then most probably you have a job and you'll be okay. Now there's no this guarantee anymore. So with automation, with AI and so on. So it's like while technology is an enabler, it's also challenging the system. So people
Right.
are think, okay, so what do we do with all this youth now?
Right.
So, another statement that I looked at is that Minerva says that its mission is twofold. One is to educate high potential individuals and to be an elite higher education institution. And on the other hand, it wants to lead the dialogue for reforming or changing the higher education. What was the feedback on the second one, like the dialogue for change?
Oh, I think, look, the issues that Minerva addresses are well known in all of the institutions. Like the example with the lectures is, like everybody would say, "Oh, lectures are terrible for learning." That's not something that is disputed at all. So there are many of these aspects that are welcomed in the community. So, I've been, even in Europe, I've been to a lot of places talking to, professionals in the education landscape, and they're thrilled. They are thrilled to see a different model working. So I think, I'm not sure, how much change can we assign to Minerva already directly. But people are very happy to see it exist, for sure.
To me, this twofold mission was a bit like Tesla when they built the Roadster and they showed like, okay, this is an elite or a premium car, but here's the technology, it works, and then it kind of, even if they will struggle financially, or I don't know what's happening with the company, they inspired a whole segment of the industry with the EVs. So while going through the story of Minerva was like, okay, so they build this premium model here, which is basically everything about it. It's rethought, and then there is this discussion that we need to change. So would you say that's a valid comparison or not really?
To some degree, for sure. So I think I remember Tesla opened their patents, like battery patents or something, to others. Yeah. So I think the book, the book we published is a bit like that. It's like open sourcing this universe to some degree, right? I think the way this comparison doesn't really work so well, is that Minerva is elitist in a certain way. So it definitely addresses a certain type of people, and, it's not for everyone to move to 7 cities in 4 years, as Minerva takes students, right? So there are many aspects that Minerva students have in common as they come, but it is a different type of elitism in a sense. It's like it's a certain profile of students, and it specifically doesn't have anything to do with financial. Minerva offers need-based financial aid. So, basically the promise is this: if you make it through the bar, the admissions bar, you'll receive an offer, and we'll bridge, wherever you are from financially, to make it possible for you to come. So that is not a roaster, in that comparison. So that doesn't really apply. It is, however, a special type of people who basically not only are able to go through this program, but will thrive, Yeah.
So your bet is that it's totally worth to support them in all possible way, including with a scholarship and a grant, because their impact in society will be way bigger than.
That's right. So speaking of, leaders,
it's a very long-term commitment.
Right, and it is indeed.
Because I'm deviating a bit from the initial list of questions, but it's very interesting because we also know that student debt is a big issue,
right?
Especially in US. And there is a statement in the book that universities, especially the elite ones, the Ivy League, should take part and share that burden, that
Absolutely.
debt. And you look like you don't share the debt because you don't. How should I say? You don't encourage. You don't create it. Instead, you are proactive, and from the beginning, you think about it in a different way.
There's a whole idea about how financing works at Minerva, and it's clearly the case that the first responsibility is the universities to keep the cost down.
Yeah.
And this is, reflected in Minerva's cost. There are a lot of things that other universities offer their students.
Can you share some of the
Stadiums, pools, luxury housing, that kind of stuff. And this is specifically not the same in Minerva, and intentionally so. Of course, we are taking the students to 7 cities around the world in 4 years.
Yeah.
They will live in the center of the city. They will share an apartment building of some sort, but the conditions are not going to be luxury. That is very important, and that's very important because they don't have to pay for luxury conditions. The university doesn't need to have the costs that other universities has because of this. So it's the decision of how the system would work is the first in place for that. And then the way financial aid works at Minerva also has like 3 other aspects to it.
Yeah, basically every single topic that we'll touch, there's more to it. And,
Yes,
and for
that
that, the book exists and you can check it out.
That's true.
But there is also a couple of other reasons behind this rotation of students through 7 cities besides the costs.
Oh, yeah.
Which is related to the way they learn, the skills and so on. So what was the thinking behind this particular cities, and why the rotation and the way that Minerva does it?
There's a lot to say there. So,
I mean, maybe you can talk about the Berlin experience because that's close to your heart, maybe.
No doubt. I'd say, first of all, no matter what you study at Minerva, be it biology, computational science, or arts, you are going to go on this rotation. The cities right now are San Francisco full year,
Yeah.
and then second year Seoul and Hyderabad, third year Berlin and Buenos Aires,
Yeah.
last year London and Taipei. Right? So if you picture this, you can see that it's a bit around the world.
Yeah.
It's different cultures, and we have programs in place for students to be able to compare how these different cultures work. So, there are reasons for every city to be in the rotation. There is a thing that city, that you can do in that city best in the world. There is something like that. But also, there are parallels to other cities, to these other cities. These are all big cities, major cities. So beyond, meeting the basic safety levels, technology levels, et cetera, there is a richness to all of those cities that is very important. So to give you a more specific example, what do you think when you think of San Francisco? What's the first thing that comes to mind in terms of industry?
Technology,
right?
expensive
Startups,
housing.
Right? Exactly, right?
Activists.
So when students come to Berlin, they would have activities that would allow them to compare. So in San Francisco, they visit, Google and startup hubs and all sorts of things like this. And then they go to Seoul, they go to Berlin, they go to Buenos Aires, and they see the same type of things done there. They have a chance to work in a local team on a local global problem, but they get to see how these cultures work. And that's very, very important. I mean, we think the world is becoming more interconnected, and students need to be able to both work within this multitude of cultures and in teams, in varied teams. So the way it works is that the entire cohort that starts in San Francisco moves around. So you're always with the same people, but they come from different countries on the one hand, and they have different interests too.
I see.
Right? So when you go to one of these startups, say, and you have a challenge that they offer us, you get to work with all these people and with the local team to get an idea about how to solve that.
And besides that, so you have a couple of bachelor program in place, and then you have two master programs.
One master program.
Program.
Yeah.
And what I found interesting, so besides the cohort being from different countries and traveling around, they can also take some courses from other programs. Like they can take a course that is in a different bachelor program. So they have to even. Yeah. So there are several ways. The way the curriculum is built is very systematic. And of course, one of the main thing a curriculum does is to make sure you have the right depth of competency. Yeah.
But then, of course, you want to be able to communicate with neighboring or different fields. So Minerva students will have to make a combination of this.
So talking about the experience, I really enjoyed reading the chapter on the learning science. And particularly, if you can comment a bit on this concept of habits of mind and fundamental concepts, that is like the foundation of everything you do. And then you have this 4 core competences, which is critical thinking, creative thinking, effective communication, and the relationships.
That's right.
Interactions. So how did you come up with that based on what? I mean, in the book, there is plenty of like recommendation for research papers and so on.
And there's the list of all of these skills, by the way. At the end of the book, there's all of this list. So I wish we would have an hour to talk only about this.
Because again, coming back to the way to explain, I find it similar to the topic of the financial aid that you said. It's a very long-term commitment to the excellence and achieving extraordinary. And the same I saw on the curriculum, that you don't look at the employment market and say, okay, these are the skills, we put them in some disciplines and we teach them. Instead, you have these habits of mind, the type of leaders that we need for tomorrow, and then you came up with this core competences. So what was the experience in the
Just
thinking?
to add something to what you say, that is not to say, we do have an employer advisory panel. And we do make sure that the skills we are teaching are relevant. It's just we don't take necessarily a short-term focus about what the skills are. So I suppose every educational initiative basically has, at this level, has a couple of goals. One of them, I suppose, is to get students ready to get jobs after studies. And we have a lot in place for that. And specializing, for example, would be one of those. But then, of course, the question is, and this is a question that every educational institution needs to answer, is what are these students going to do 30 years from now? And how do you educate people for a world that you don't know what it looks like 30 years from now? And we know the world is changing quickly. There are lots of jobs that exist today that didn't exist yesterday, and the other way around. There are lots of jobs that will disappear, as you mentioned before, AI, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you make sure this is done well? So liberal arts programs have an answer, a few answers to this. The way Minerva answers it is very, very, very special. So, and it's done in a special way. Basically, we have this collection of skills that we get to teach directly. This is very important to understand because other liberal arts programs basically hope to teach the same skills. Critical thinking is what everyone says they're teaching, right?
Yeah.
But the way they do it is, you teach philosophy or logic or mathematics, and you hope the students will get the sense for what these skills are.
Yeah.
And Stephen was saying at some point that, with his background of cognitive psychology and neuroscience, why are we not teaching these things directly? Why are we not teaching critical thinking directly? And he realized why. This is not one skill.
Yeah.
It's a series of skills that they would come together, and together they make up critical thinking.
Yeah. That was really interesting, like to go through the techniques and the types of critical thinking, especially now as we have the rise of populism,
Right.
fake news, and so on. It was like really basically everything that I was reading was like, this makes sense.
Right.
But there's so much work behind and putting
Oh,
it
yeah.
in place. And speaking about this, I was trying to also search through some comments from students about their experience at Minerva, including there were some students that felt a bit overwhelmed or slightly frustrated that there's so much and it's so different from
Right.
the usual
Yes.
stuff. So what is your experience? How do students cope with so much new stuff, so many new ways of doing things?
So I think the main challenge there is, it's kind of interesting, right? All Minerva students have been successful academically before they come to Minerva, right? And now they come to Minerva where they have a very different grading system.
Yeah.
That takes into account where they are actually in the process of learning. We have a rubric system where, 1 basically represents you have no idea of what this concept is, and 5 represents mastery of that concept. So you're able to use this concept in a situation very different than the situation you learn in. This is the FAR transfer part, and also unprompted. Nobody told you, oh, by the way, you can use that. So that is what we're trying to do, and we're helping students to move along this. So now, of course, when you're learning something, you're probably mediocre for bright students, right? Or slightly over, the mediocre part. And of course, students are shocked, right? They were always A students or whatever the grading system is, or definitely up there. So suddenly they are surprised by this. So there is a lot of this process that is new. For example, of course, how is learning done in other places? It needs to feel hard, effortful, etc. So the way you do it is, stay here and memorize tons of words and etc.
Stress at exams.
Exactly, big exams, whatever. You don't have to memorize things like this at Minerva, because the way the academic process works and the way we know from the science of learning this learning works is that you just engage with that particular thing from different perspectives over time, etc., etc. And this is something that we can do very systematically in the way we teach at Minerva. So these things are very special, and students are at first a bit taken aback on several grounds. However, it's super interesting to see them coming back maybe after the first summer when they did some internship.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh my God, these concepts were popping out in my mind whenever I needed this. It was that and that and that and that.
Yeah,
it was amazing. So that kind of thing. This is the part that we teach students, the habits of mind, the foundational concept. We short them to 8 C's. We teach them in the first year. We introduce them in the first year. And we really believe in these things. So we make sure this is repeated for the next years.
All right, so little technical glitch in there. We have 2 more questions regarding the student experience, and then we shift into what's in there for Minerva in the future, and quick summary of this conversation. So, in a chapter on the different residences and also in the learning science, you mentioned a term, learning situations, where basically you take students into the field and you design a learning situation. In our conversation in Paris, you mentioned something about going to a site from the World War II and then having a conversation with students. How do you design this learning experience? What's the goal behind that?
There are a few sort of dimensions I'm thinking of this. Maybe an important thing is, of course, Minerva students get to apply every week. Whatever they studied from Monday to Thursday in their classes, they get to apply it on Friday and the weekends, on whatever we offer, right? So, of course, there are some goals that are, typically learning, learning objective-like, just like a lesson plan would work in a sense. But then, of course, what is the most interesting part about experiencing something in reality is that it's so nuanced, right? Reality is very different. So if you'd have very strict learning goals there, it would be very limiting.
Yeah.
What you're trying to do is, on the one hand, open up the possibilities, make sure that some of these things will come up by certain questions, leading questions, redundancies in the way you design the activity. So, somebody will tell you, by the way, I think this connects to X, right? If possible, not have to ask that directly. So that sort of spreads naturally around the group.
Okay, but you design for this kind of aha moments, right?
Yes. So that is one aspect. But then you also really hope you have a lot more than what you planned for. So what you're looking for is a situation that, on the one hand, meets some minimum requirements, but then is so rich and nuanced that allows people to go in directions that you didn't expect. So I think this is a significant difference with the academic side, right? What you're trying to do in the real experience is to scaffold just as much as possible, so students kind of get that idea without you being there, basically.
I see. And this question is a bit backwards. I was supposed to ask it at the very beginning, but what is if we can kind of package the student experience from the moment they thought about applying to Minerva and the graduation moment, what are some of the key milestones that they go through? Besides just saying year 1, year 2, like in terms of kind of experiences. Okay, so the big one is you need to get in. So there's a certain process. But
so there's an application process is definitely quite different than what they're used to. We don't require SATs, but we have our own very rigorous system. And there's also a process where we take students together with their parents in, and we make sure that everybody understands exactly what Minerva is about and what Minerva cares about. So when they come there, they don't expect things like, oh, it's a party university, for example, right? So it's often the case that when students first hear about Minerva, they think, oh, 7 cities, that is amazing, I'm going to party everywhere. And then we need to make sure that they understand how much academic matters, how much other things they would have to do before the partying thing.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of information going on there. Then after they decide to enroll, I think maybe on the academic side, the way it would work, it goes is that in the first year, they're introduced to the habits of mind and foundational concepts. They have no choice in it. We think these are so important and they'll be able to apply them all the time throughout their lives.
And these are independent from their bachelor of choice, right?
Exactly. So they don't even need to make a choice of a bachelor at that time,
Okay.
of the school or whatever they would specialize in. They are, of course, looking around to see what's possible and what they like, but they do the habits of mind. That's what they're learning.
That's interesting. So what are you saying is in the first year, they don't have any tag attached to their name. Like this is your bachelor.
Exactly.
It's just...
That's right. Very unusual in Europe, more usual in the US where you get to decide this later.
I see.
So in the second year, you start narrowing down in a sense, and you go maybe one major or a combination in a couple of the schools we have and take courses exploring that possibility. The third year, you sort of deepen that experience and that knowledge. What's very important to know is that in the last year, you get a lot of freedom. And not only freedom, you get the responsibility that comes with that, in that you design your own curriculum.
Wow.
And Minerva helps you find experts to teach it, to make sure that whatever your final work will be like, and that can bridge whatever fields you can imagine, that whatever you're working on is relevant within a field. But this is a lot. Groups of 3 to 5 students get together that have overlapping interests, and we find, tutors for them, experts, professors, etc., in the area to help them do that. But that is a lot of freedom. So it goes in terms of a flexibility of the academic learning. That's kind of how it goes. We think as they get the skills to make the decisions, that's when they should get the decision too.
Yeah.
So that's one aspect. Then, of course, there's the rotation, the immersion in various cities. There are all sorts of things that change. Students get more and more options that they can go deeper in without us necessarily over-designing experiences.
Yeah,
as they become more experienced and they know better what they want. On the professional development side, it's similar too. They get a job coach from the first year. So the professional development department helps them figure out, on the one hand, what they want to do, or if they already know that, what would be the right path for them to build the network, the professional experience throughout the 4 years. So they have, they have the possibility, obviously in the summer, to do full-time internships, 3 to 4 months, and they have some possibility to work also throughout the year, but not very much because of the academics.
I see.
So, and it's the same thing. You try to figure out in the first year kind of what I want to do. You get an internship, you reflect on that and move on, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see how are these things that you're learning in class really working in the real world? How are these implemented? How does research work for people who go to research? How does, who knows what businesses work in reality as opposed to whatever you learn? So I think this is, in a sense, the belief there is that we should expose students to the situations, to the places, to the people that they can learn best from. So in the academics, you learn fundamental concepts in those fields, and we make sure they master them. And professional development, for example, make sure they have a good understanding and a good path of experience, so it would be very easy for them to get a job as they come out. It happens enough that students get job offers already in the summers from the internships.
That's no surprise.
Yeah.
So this is all exciting, and I want to move a bit into how can this expand to other universities or to society, but starting with Minerva. So I don't know if it's a commercial secret or what's next for Minerva? Like, what are you guys planning, developing?
So there are a lot of things, right? We want to be part of this dialogue and what needs to happen in education.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of possibilities. We collaborate with universities. We collaborate with corporations, in all sorts of things. So we're looking for partnerships where we can bring some of value similar to what we do in education. So there's no necessarily super clear path of like how this will go. It would depend on what opportunities are there. But Minerva is committed to improve this landscape in general.
So I think in one of the first chapters and also in the videos that I saw of Ben, you can feel this like super confidence, like we have the best offer. It makes sense from the science point of view, from the technology point of view, and you guys want to disrupt the elite higher education by 10x and 10x improvement on that. At the same time, through the book, I found moments where you are also humble that this is just the beginning. It's an experiment. We still improve the students and so on. So that's why I said at the very beginning, it takes a lot of courage to change this this industry, if I can call it industry. So how, based on your experience, how can other universities and other people learn on your experience and basically, besides the book, which you shared, like here's how we did it, do you have any effort to kind of spread out your ideas and your maybe software and everything that you built to other higher institutions?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're looking for partners to spread this out in all areas, basically. So, anybody who's interested in this kind of stuff, so there are all sorts of layers of possible things that Minerva would do, from, simply presenting how the model works, helping other people, other institutions grow something similar or take certain parts, etc., to, potentially licensing the platform, the intellectual property. We built this curriculum from scratch, right? On all these areas. So there's a lot of new pedagogical tools that we use on this digital platform that we believe is very would apply in a lot of situations. So it's definitely things we're open to.
Yeah. One idea that came to my mind while looking at Minerva was, it's probably a speculation in my mind, but when you look at all this, it's like, all right, it makes sense from the science point of view and so on. But then you think one of the constraints is, especially, for example, if you look at the last year, the students have like a coach and they have a mentor, and you think, oh, that's intense from the point of view of finances and so on. And I was thinking, so you are from the private sector and you can do it, but what if a government, for example, or the Minister of Education from a country looks at Minerva and all the science that there is and says, what if we could rethink all the education in our country based on science? And if that, so first the question is, what needs to happen that this kind of reform is possible? And the second, if today a country approaches you and a Minister of Education and say, hey, we love what you do and we want to expand it at the country level, can you help us?
Oh, wow.
It's just kind of an exercise.
Countries have very different requirements of their educational system than Minerva does. I think at this point, when Minerva was built, there are so many moving parts, right? And they make sense together. It's very hard to say how would something like this work if you change some of the parts. So, for example, state education is radically inclusive, right? Because it's a human right to teach, right? Well, Minerva has the privilege to choose students who are particularly passionate, for example, right? So everything we designed is designed for people who are independent, passionate, have the energy, have the mental capacities to go through this material at a certain pace, have the discipline, I suppose, to do a lot on their own, right?
But I guess, don't you think if you had applied all the principles from the book at an early age, like when they're toddlers and kindergarten, I don't know if we need this structure anymore, but if you apply it early on, that will have more of those passionate, committed young people.
So there's no doubt to me that, taking some part of what we do, like the learning principle, couldn't hurt. It could only improve everything.
Yeah.
The question is, I suppose, how much you can improve like everything. And how, like, what is the part that you can take, and what are the things that are absolutely necessary, speaking of how these experiences are built, etc., etc. Let's not forget that, I suppose, tuition at Minerva is not very high compared to what universities in Europe spend for students. So there's a lot that can be done within that model, no doubt. But I think that would be a serious process of like building this together for sure.
One of the things that I was thinking as also as a constraint is that governments are part of a lot of multi-level agreements between countries, transfer of credit, so they need these standards. Everyone kind of needs to be the same. So it's very difficult for a country to say, you know what, we're going to take a rethinking exercise, take apart everything and put together a new model the way you did for higher education. So it would take a way more effort and political will, I guess, too.
Political will, no doubt. But what I think is important is to know is that, and this is a question that we get fairly often, is Minerva figured out this way that on the one hand takes students that come from the usual high schools, right? There's nothing necessarily special about those. They do go through the classic academic systems, and at the same time gives them regular degrees, Bachelor of Arts, Bachelor of whatever, Masters, etc., right? So the interface, if you want, with the rest of the world did not change, right? So the requirements there are definitely fulfilled.
I see.
However, what we managed to do inside is that we do a lot more. And I think, and I wonder what is the right, what is the type of institution that could do the same?
Yeah.
All right. So I'm not sure if, basically you're interfacing, you are in a certain system, no doubt. And it is up to people to decide how much they want to count on that, how much they want to be part of the conversation in general, right? If you do something very different that doesn't fit at all in the current landscape, then you're probably out of the conversation too. So there are certain things that we can build. But I don't know if that, there's no doubt that there's a lot of work to be done in terms of like politically aligning things like this, no doubt.
I see. To me was, again, this idea like this and this makes sense. Why can't we transfer? And there is a moment in the book where you talk about transferring certain concepts from one area to another. So it's like, can we get some of this and put it at a broader level? And I know that also Ben in a talk says, trying to educate every single one dilutes the quality of education, and maybe not every single person needs to go to university. Maybe they have other options and other passion and so on. Yeah. But at the same time, I was like, this sounds so good. Can we like share some of it with other institutions at the broader level? So
that's why we published the book. Yeah. That's why we have that list, right? We have this list of habits of mind that we believe would be useful to anyone at any time. And as I'm not sure if it's the last chapter or one of the last chapters for sure, this is a challenge too.
Yeah.
Right? People can take it, build upon it, find new ways to approach it, etc.
Yeah.
What Minerva does is to show that this is possible. It's possible, and it's possible to be a part of this conversation at the same time.
Yeah. So, talking about the conversation, I wish we had more time, but it becomes very difficult for people to listen through like 2 hours of the interview, and you need to catch your train. So let's wrap up this interview. First, besides the building the intentional university, do you personally recommend any other resources for people who want to get to know more about Minerva or the science of learning, and basically people that are in the education space and they want to do something based on your story or inspired by your story?
Maybe the first thing I could say is that just like email. Write to us. Everybody's super responsive at Minerva, and everybody's interested in education in general and willing to help clarify things, answer questions, whatever they can do. So I think email is an easy thing. Resources in general, I think it's hard to say. There are so many aspects to education. So depending where your work is, I think there's a lot to be said. There's a lot done, and there's a lot more to go.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. That's an interesting insight that you gave right there. There's so many aspects to education. You can look through economics, through well-being, through psychology, through communication, relationships, and so much. So it's good to at some point try to have resources per category or competences.
Yeah, absolutely.
That would be great if we can do it one day. What is your advice, or if you have any suggestion for educators, so those who are today in a university or high school and they have a teaching position, and maybe they read the learning science chapter from the book, or they generally are interested and they want to do something a bit outside their box. Based on your experience with the faculty at Minerva, what can you suggest?
I think reading that chapter is, and there are a couple more things about like what active learning means of Minerva, for example, and fully active learning, etc. And I think taking that to heart and thinking about designing a class like that is essential as much as they could do it. And especially if they do sort of alternative things. Another thing that I think is really useful is to have communities of people interested in teaching. So, the math teachers or whatever can get together. And that type of interaction can be amazing. And basically that way they would gather, if you want to say the best practices, they can improve like that together. They have a support community that can help them with various aspects. So there are so many parts to teaching, and depending on what level in the age, like the age of the students, et cetera, where I think having a community like this is essential.
I see. On the stepping in other shoes, teenagers, so those who are in high school and maybe they're high potential, they have passion for certain things, but they're so bored and they don't really fit in the system. So maybe like imagine the potential Minerva students, so that are bored within the high school today. What are some of the techniques or activities they can do to basically enrich their learning independently of the constraints that they have?
I think I had this problem in high school myself. I think what's one way to put it that's sort of constructive, other than say, I don't need this, why do I do it at all, is to realize that you're not forced to do the minimum required. So I always found it interesting to spend more time on like a topic, like Latin or history or whatever, rather than the minimum that I was given at school. So I think if you look at it this way, then there's no need to be bored or, whatever. You just go deeper in all of these areas and think of the standards that the school has as the minimum thing. It's sort of one aspect of school. Then there is a lot of stuff outside school too. So, and I think this is a really important part to do. Like, think about what can you do, what do you care about outside. There's a lot more to life than the academic part. And of course, the academic part is essential because you don't want to reinvent the wheel, I suppose. This is one reason education exists. But there's a lot you can do. And there are, especially, in businesses, for example, or whatever, where people solving problem, bringing some sort of solution that clearly people are looking for, and you're the one seeing it. It's all worth doing.
I see.
There are many paths.
Really quick, and this is a difficult one to do it in a quick way.
Scary.
If you become the Minister of Education, what are the first 3 actions that you do?
Whoa.
You take?
Whoa. Okay.
First thing that comes to mind.
I think the way I am is like I would want to understand how this works.
Yeah.
So I'd like to understand how the different systems in education work. It's because school has a lot of purposes in life.
Yeah.
In the life of a nation, one of them has less to do with education. For example, I heard somebody, and people are making fun of this, but there's some truth to it, that people use schools because they don't want to hire babysitters.
Yeah.
Right? And that makes sense. If you think about it, people have jobs, et cetera, you understand how this, is a need. And the question is what limitations you have.
Yeah.
So I think having a good idea about like how things work would be one. But then maybe the second one would be find the things that work.
Okay.
And attempt them again somewhere else.
I see.
Because I don't think there's a clear answer.
You still have time.
I don't think there's a clear answer or a unique answer to what education should be like or whatever. So I think it's important to have this to have several things working at once.
I see. Imagine you become the benevolent dictator of the advertising world. And this is called a t-shirt question. The reason is every episode we try to summarize one idea that we print on a t-shirt. But imagine the question like this. For 1 minute, all around the world, in all the ad space, like being it a web banner or a print or a bus stop, there is a message displayed. A quote to the world that is yours. What does it say?
Wow. I do feel I need to think about this more.
I don't know.
Wow.
It can be related to anything that you care about, not necessarily just the work.
I don't know if I...
And we are going to print it.
Okay.
On a t-shirt.
Very interesting. I probably should get back to you on this, but I think I don't know if I'm necessarily the type that thinks that, things can be captured in like
one sentence.
Bumper sticker type of thing. So can I refuse the question this way?
But that's a great way. So you just said, I don't believe that life can be captured
in one sentence. Yeah, maybe.
But you said the bumper stick.
Yeah.
That's a great quote. I love it.
Okay.
we can put it at the bus stop.